Welcome everybody to our second Phinney Books editor sessions. I'm Tom Nisley as always, and I am once again in the back of Phinney Books. We are still closed on Sundays, although we are thrillingly open for browsing as of a week and a day ago. 5 people at a time, masks on. I'm the only one here, so I don't have a mask. And that seems to have been working great. It's been great to see people in person, feeling like an actual bookstore and not a warehouse again. So we are joined by two guests. Last time we had two editors from two different presses. This time we have an editor from the University of Washington Press, Andrew Berzanskis, who is the senior acquisitions editor. And our special guest today, our first author guest at an editor session, is David B. Williams, who many of you know as the author of Seattle Walks. Possibly, I should have counted, I would say it's easily among our top 10 best-selling books in the history of Phinney Books. I'll do a quick bios. So we're going to talk, again, the format will be talking kind of generally about editing, about publishing in Seattle, about Andrew's work and the UW Press. And then Andrew will talk about 3 books, 2 that have just been published, one that is maybe a little less than a year away from being published. And that's where David comes in again, because that's his book, which is coming out next spring. So Andrew is the senior acquisitions editor at the UW Press. He works kind of both sides of the press, so books for general readers and books for scholarly audiences, which is one thing I want to ask him about. And you can follow him on Twitter at ABERZANSKIS. And he is Zooming from Colorado, where he often Zooms from because that's where he spends most of his time. He visits Seattle regularly, but is always working remotely. So this isn't that different for you these times. And then David, very much a Seattle resident, naturalist, author, and educator. Although the one thing in his bio he didn't mention that I feel like a lot of people in Seattle know him from is his walking tours of Seattle natural and cultural history. And that's kind of, that meeting point has been his subject in Seattle Walks, in Too High and Too Steep, another Phinney favorite. And then he's also the author of Stories in Stone, Cairns, and the co-author of Waterway. He's a curatorial associate at the Burke Museum, which I don't even know what that is. We might ask you about that. And his next book, Homewaters, which we will be talking about, a human and natural history of Puget Sound, will be published in 2021 by the University of Washington Press. So thanks for coming, guys.
Thank you.
And then there'll be time at the end for Q&A, not spoken, but in the chat you can add questions and I will ask them for you. Andrew, let's talk publishing and publishing in Seattle. So I guess, how did you get into this business? People have different paths to become editors.
So right now I'm an acquisitions editor at the University of Washington Press. And as you said, I work in trade books, which are books about the region. They're books on the natural environment. They're books in popular science. And on the academic side, I work in books in environmental history, and I do some social justice oriented books in sociology and geography. The place that I got started was an undergrad. I was an undergraduate English major at the University of Texas, and I got an internship with a literary publicist. And what that means is that's the person who promotes books, who tries to get authors into newspapers, tries to get book reviews. And I did that for a few years after undergrad too. While I was doing this, I realized that first of all, it's really hard to get attention for books.
As we all know.
You're competing against to get attention for. And secondly, I realized that some books are a lot better than others. And I would be on the phone with a journalist and I'd have, 45 seconds of their time to make the case for their book. And as I'm rattling off my pitch, and I could already hear the journalist shaking their head no on the other side of the phone, I'd be in my head, like muttering at the author, like, why didn't you just write a different book? Like, my job would be easier if you just wrote a different book entirely. Or, your book is so good, but I would be thinking to the author in my head, this title is so terrible. Like, why didn't you fix that from the beginning? So as I was working and getting frustrated and thinking these thoughts, I discovered the University of Texas Press had a one-year fellowship to train people to be acquisitions editors. And I didn't know at the time that what I wanted to be is what's called an acquisitions editor. And that's the very first person that an author interacts with at the press, who helps decide what the press publishes or says no to things, but also helps shape the book with an eye towards having the biggest possible impact later in the process. So that was my entry point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you kind of, I like that you came at it from the opposite end of the funnel, that you saw how books were being received, and that made you want to get to the beginning of how they're made and kind of get to that point. And that's I think something authors often don't think of. They like how, and something that I am intensely aware of as a bookseller, like, you know, being on where the rubber meets the road, trying to communicate a book to a customer in a sentence or two, or just from a cover. So you, and how did you end up at the UW?
So I've worked at a couple of different presses since then. I've worked in books for about 20 years. And maybe actually before I talk about my own career path, let me describe university presses a little bit more so it all makes sense. So university presses most of them began in the past 100 or so years. 2020 actually marks the 100th anniversary of the University of Washington Press. But the way the university presses started was a lot of books that were important to the academy weren't getting published by big New York City publishers. You know, scholarly books on history, scholarly books on literature that were really important to the discourse, important to libraries. There just wasn't enough money there for a New York publisher to pick it up. And that's where universities started starting their own presses. And these are all over the country. So, you know, Stanford University Press is in Palo Alto. University of Virginia Press is in Charlottesville. You know, University of Minnesota Press is in Minneapolis. And so what's really interesting to me about university presses is they're highly decentralized. If you work in trade publishing, the world revolves around Manhattan, particularly a couple blocks in Manhattan. University press publishing is really different. It's all over the country. It's highly decentralized. And I think because of that, presses have a much keener sense about the parts of the country that they're publishing books in. So I gave you that quick preface is because when you talk to somebody who works in academic publishing or university press publishing about their career, basically what you're going to hear them talk about is all the college towns they've lived in. Like, it's not a matter of, you know, moving to Manhattan to intern at a big agency to, you know, get your resume stamped. It's moving college town to college town, which if you like that kind of thing is absolutely fantastic. So my own career took me through the University of Georgia Press, which is in Athens, Georgia. I worked for a commercial publisher in Boulder, Colorado. I worked as a freelancer as a remote editor at West Virginia University Press, which is a lot of fun. And the way that I wound up working here at the University of Washington Press is I started doing some remote work for the University of Washington Press. And an editor left, and by that time I established relationships with the various people at the press, and I was able to slide into that.
And have university presses always had the trade side that they do now, or do you know when that's developed?
So that's something that's relatively new over the past, let's say, 30 or 40 years, because they really did start out trying to publish their own faculty, and it's very, very, very different now. University of Washington Press, we still have a number of really strong scholarly lists that align with the core strengths of the university. We have a really strong Asian studies program. We have a really strong critical gender and race studies program. My list, I work in environmental history, that our books are written by professors, you know, for other professors or for students or, you know, some general interest readers. But most university presses now, maybe a third of the books they might do are cookbooks. They might be fiction. They might be popular history about a region. They may be natural history guides, or they may be books like David's.
Yeah, and that seems like it's been a natural, the way you were talking about it being decentralized, that the New York publisher can't publish for Seattle as well as a Seattle publisher or a Minneapolis publisher, or it seems like that's been a real natural connection, that a lot of the trade side of university presses has been local stuff.
Definitely. And university presses, so they're obviously not for profit. You might even say anti-profit, ha ha ha. but they're mission-oriented presses. Like we have a very specific, when we publish, we have a certain set of goals we're trying to accomplish in elevating what's most interesting and most distinct and enduring about the region. I think that I would say that while we certainly publish for readers in Washington and the Pacific Northwest, we're definitely also trying to think about what about the Pacific Northwest is interesting to the rest of the country. Just to give you an example of that, earlier this year, we published a book by a UW faculty member in architecture. And let me get the exact title for you. The title of the book was Sculpture on a Grand Scale, Jack Christensen's Thin Shell Modernism. Now, if you know who Jack Christensen is, you know that he designed Kingdom. This is somebody who, obviously, this is a story that's very important to the region, but this is also a book that got reviewed in the New York Times Style section with other design books. And so that's the kind of thing we think about, like what's important to the region, but what's also going to catch national attention. Mm-hmm. Earlier this year, we also published a book called The Whale and the Cupcake. It's about food in Alaska. It was written by Julie O'Malley, who's an Alaska food writer. It was a book we co-published with the Anchorage Museum, and it's a book about what it's like to eat in Alaska and why, and gorgeous illustrations. And Sam Sifton, who's the chief food writer at the New York Times, gave it a lovely shout out in his New York Times newsletter. And again, that's an example of, this is a book that, again, we think of as speaking to our region, but we ask ourselves, what about our region is interesting nationally as well?
And do you, when you are acquiring a book, and that's another thing I want to ask about, but do you immediately say to yourself, this is going to be on the scholarly side, this is going to be on the trade side? And for the people outside the business, that actually is a huge distinction for someone like me, because I pay a lot more for a scholarly book. Just the business is not really set up to sell those through bookstores, or at least most bookstores like mine. So it's a huge distinction for me. A book that's a scholarly book, I'm not going to carry unless someone orders it. So when you make that distinction, there's really a hard line between where that book is going to get out. So I'm curious if a book starts out scholarly and then you think, oh, this has trade appeal, so we're going to make this more broadly available than we thought it was going to be.
I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's really clear cut. And the reason is that if it's a professor who is in the academy and they're writing for other professors, they're engaging with a very specific literature that they want to get down and dirty into the details. If you're writing for a broader audience, you need a writer who can tell a story. I mean, you need a writer who can make them laugh, make them cry, something that, somebody's reading before they're nodding off to sleep. And that's just a really different thing to do. And there certainly are scholarly books that blur those lines, and we're always looking for the next scholar who can write for a broader audience, because that's a real value to us. But they're certainly very different. Of course, on the other hand, there's people like David, who we'll talk about later, but who is definitely writing for a popular audience. He's definitely writing for the person who wants to read while they're, riding the bus. But he's also uncovering new archival material. It's also of interest to scholars. David wears a lot of hats that way, that a lot of people it's harder for them to pull off.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe there's a question for both of you now, because when I first talked to you, Andrew, a while back, one of the things that struck me, because I'm still learning about the publishing side of things, my assumption for the way books got made was an author writes a book, takes it to a publisher or an agent as a kind of complete book, or maybe even a proposal that's pretty thoroughly thought out. And then the editor says, yes or no, I'm not interested, or I am interested. And you said that maybe even a majority of your books start with you, not with the author, or that you're scouting not just for finished proposals or books or even chapters that's things that are published out there already. You have an idea for a book that there would be interest in, and you often find the author for that. Is that true?
Most editors I know are highly proactive. I mean, you certainly can wait for authors to contact you, and you can wait for agents to bring things to you, and we certainly get books that way, and that's an important part of our list. But as an editor, I actually spend a lot more time before I worked in publishing, I thought that my job as an editor was that there would just be piles of manuscripts on my desk. And in my infinite wisdom, I would say, this one's special, let's do this. And having editorial judgment is certainly a big part of my job. But really what I want to do is get out and talk to the author who's going to write the next big thing before another editor does. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. A couple years ago, Columbia Journalism School, they award an annual an award for environmental journalism. And they released a big list of winners. And at the top, there were like names you'd recognize it, you know, National Geographic, News. And I'm reading through this list of award winners. And further down the list for local journalism, I see the name of the environment reporter at the Missoulian newspaper. And my ears perk up because first of all, as you know, the Columbia Journalism School is, you know, the gold stamp of approval. But this is somebody who's writing in our area, and our area as a press is Washington, Oregon, Montana, Idaho, and Alaska, writing environmental journalism. And that's the kind of thing that, like, to me sends off, like, Spidey says, this could be our guy. I got in touch with the author and said, hey, I read his work online, and he was really good, a fantastic writer, senior journalist. And I said, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? Like, you're clearly doing interesting stuff. And he said, yeah, I've actually been writing about, you know, grizzly bears for the past couple of decades. And, you know, we've gone from having them nearly wiped out in the early 70s to now we have so many grizzly bears in Montana. We're having these really big, awkward conversations about how sincerely we want to bring nearly extinct animals back. And so conversation started there. And based on his reporting, we have a book coming out this fall called The Grizzly in the Driveway, Return of Bears to the American West. That, for a book for general readers, that's a more likely process for me to go to from initial contact to getting a book.
Nice.
Can I interrupt? Andrew, is that's more of an academic press operating procedure, or do you hear of that in other presses? I mean, you certainly get some of it, but would you say it's more academic than non?
I would say that if you were at a really big press like Knopf, that $100 bills just rain down on your desk. Like gorgeous manuscripts just land on your desk, and you've got Umberto Eco writing to you. I think that if you are in the middle tier, like we are in terms of our size and the number of books we do, it gets to be a lot more competitive. I bet it's different at Harvard University Press. I think that if you're a regional publisher, you have to be a little scrappier and a little more proactive in terms of shaping it. Also, as a press, we have a really clear idea about what we want to do next. Like we have a vision for the next 5 years of things where we want to do more books. And what's tough is that if we haven't done books in an area before, it's hard to get authors or agents to start sending us proposals until we do that. So to give you another example, you know, the UW has a great earth science faculty. So we want to do more popular books in earth science to align with the strengths of the university. And so one of the ways that I'm doing that, and this will just show you how an acquisitions editor mind works, is, okay, I want to do more books in earth science. What's interesting in earth science? Earthquakes. Earthquakes that kill people. So I spent some time on the internet. I figured out what are the biggest earthquakes that have happened in the US in the past 100 years. What were the deadliest ones? What were the ones that scientists said were interesting? And which ones have people written books about? And I pulled up 4 or 5 pretty significant earthquakes where nobody's given it a book-length treatment. Now, I'm not a historian. I can't look at these enough to say what a narrative about each of those would be. But I knew if I started nosing around on these and started talking to people and use this as an entry point to start talking to experts, I'd find somebody who could do something. And so eventually I wrote a senior scholar, she's a seismologist who's written a lot of books for popular audiences about earthquakes. And I realized, I think it was at the 1925 Santa Barbara earthquake that nobody had written about, even though it was important for a lot of reasons, a lot of people died. And so I wrote her out of the blue and said, hey, this seems like a big, fat, juicy book topic right here. Would you be interested in taking this on for me? And in this case, she wrote back and she said, not that book idea, no. But she said, as a matter of fact, I have a book idea right now where that's a chapter. And her book turned out, because she's smarter than me and obviously knows what's really interesting here more than me because I'm not an expert. But it turned out that she was writing a book about what's called the Great Quake Debate in the early 1900s in Southern California. And basically, you know, we all take it for granted now that Southern California is earthquake country. That wasn't taken for granted 100 years ago. And in fact, seismology was in its infancy. And there was a very high profile, very public debate between two scientists debating over, whether or not people should be alarmed, whether or not there should be new housing codes for safety. And of course, in the midst of this, the 1925 Santa Barbara earthquake, boom, rips it apart. And so that's actually a book that's coming out this summer. It's called The Great Quake Debate, The Crusader, the Skeptic, and the Rise of Modern Seismology. But that's an example of me trying, how an acquisitions editor thinks, how can I start nosing around in an area to go find somebody to, see if we can get the ball rolling.
Yeah. David, how have your books come about? Have they started with you, or anybody come to you and said, we'd like you to write a book on this subject?
Most of the ideas that I have had, or most of the books have been my ideas, where I've been thinking about something for a while or been interested. I mean, Stories in Stone, which is this book, a collection of stories about how people use stone as a building material, really grew out of when I moved to Boston. I'd been living in southern Utah for almost a decade, and my wife and I moved to Boston, and I went from this land of amazing red rock to Massachusetts, where I could sum up my geology in 2 words, Plymouth Rock. I basically knew nothing. But as I started walking down the streets and looking and seeing all these buildings, I started thinking about, looking at those and the connections I could make between people and landscape, as you said earlier, which is my interest. And so I started doing a variety of articles about it and had some success. And then I got to a point where I decided, okay, I either have to work on a book or just give up this idea. I have to move on, because it was always sort of, in Andrew's phrase, it was just noodling in my brain. And so that one ended up, I found an agent through a friend, actually through the writer David Laskin, and sent a, 6-paragraph, 7-paragraph description to her. And we then spent 9 months working on a proposal to shop around to presses. And yeah, very painful process. In contrast, this little book I did on cairns, the little piles of stone, I had been working on a book about dinosaurs, which was arguably probably one of the more brilliant ideas on dinosaurs known. But apparently no one else thought that except me. It kept getting rejected by my agent, by publisher. So I decided, I'm going to give up on this and figure out what's next. So I had met Kate Rogers, or corresponded with Kate at Mountaineers. And I just wrote Kate out of the blue, said, hey, do you want to go out for a cup of coffee? And we went to had a cup of coffee, and I was telling her about what I was doing. And she had seen one of my books, so knew a little bit about me. And during the conversation, she said, I've always wanted to do a book about cairns, and I've asked a bunch of other people. And I thought, cairns, that's a cool idea. And 3 weeks later, I had a proposal to her, and 9 months later, the manuscript was in and done. But otherwise, no. It's an idea that I come up with, even though perhaps the next book I'm working on is a book of fossils of Washington State, which goes sort of along with Andrew's thing about the UW or the press reaching out. They had been in contact with some of the curators at the museum, at the Burke Museum. And one of them in particular, Liz Nesbitt, who is now a retired invertebrate paleontologist. Liz had long wanted to do a book about fossils in Washington State. And so I've worked with Liz over the years. I've been in education at the Burke for many years. And basically the press approached me to see, hey, are you interested in working with Liz on this book idea? And so we're now working on a proposal, working on writing up stuff. So yeah, I guess now that you ask, yes, I guess I have been approached.
Yeah.
But mostly it's ideas in my little brain.
What does curatorial associate mean at the Burke Museum? A lot of money. Those $100 bills.
Yeah, exactly. About as many float down as float down at the press. It's an affiliation through the cultural department that's sort of beneficial in both directions. Theoretically, they can ask me stuff and I can ask them. And it's just sort of a way to expand the Burke family. So there's a bunch of different people who have connections with them at a variety of different levels. So we actually talked about this before you started, related to
one of the other things you do. I'm just curious, in the COVID era, how your sidewalk tours have been going.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, I had been doing tours for, many groups in Seattle, MoHI, Seattle Architecture Foundation, Historic Seattle. And obviously I'm not doing those anymore. So I basically have taken several of my walks, my walk that I do around the Denny Regrade, which is in Seattle Walks, my Building Stone walk that's in Seattle Walks. And then the third one I'm just finishing up is looking at the carved and terracotta animals in Seattle, and have converted those to virtual walks. So it's a PowerPoint presentation that I narrate with sort of, depending on the first two walks are sort of before and after. And what's fun is with the virtual aspect, I can do things I never did before. Like on a walk, I could say, oh, it's at a quarry in Minnesota. Well, now with Google Earth, I can create a map and I can fly you to the quarry and zoom you in on the quarry and then back out, and here's a photo of the quarry. So they're really fun. So I've been doing those with Airbnb, Seattle Architecture Foundation, Historic Seattle. So yeah, they're really fun for me, and it's surprising how much the variety of people, and people come from all over the world for the walks, and they're great because it's $7, $5 or $7 for one of these. So there's information, if you're interested, there's information on my website, geologywriter.com.
Right. And I guess my last general, I think one nice thing about this session is there's definitely a theme once we get to talking about the books, and I think we've touched on a little bit already, but the three books that Andrew's going to talk about are all local, but not just local. They're at, I think what David does is this connection between the natural and cultural history. So I don't know if you, it's clearly something you're interested in as an editor and as a press. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that generally. It'll definitely come up when we talk about the books, but that's fascinating to me, that the way that nature and culture work together.
And I think that if you're looking at books about the Pacific Northwest, it's just a particularly rich area because there's so much going on in both of those spheres, and the overlay between them. There's just so much to look at that makes it fascinating. Should I go and jump into the books?
Sure. Let's talk about.
Can I just interrupt real quickly for 1 second? And so, yeah, the way I think about it is I describe myself as a natural history writer, and I'm interested in both the nature of place and the history of place, as opposed to, say, being a nature writer. I'm not a nature writer. I'm really a natural history writer. So that's where that interfingering is.
Yeah, I became pretty conscious of that when someone we both admire, David, I know Robert McFarlane, was in town last year, and I got to talk to him, and I was reading up on stuff. And again, he's described as a nature writer, but one of the most fascinating things about his work is that it's never just about nature. It's people in nature and people, that connection back and forth with language, with built environments. So that back and forth, it's hard to imagine anything that nature is separate in any way these days, but I like it when writers are conscious of that back and forth. But speaking of nature, the return of nature, Andrew could talk about After the Blast.
So here's an example of a story about the Pacific Northwest that is not just of interest to the people who live in the Pacific Northwest. Mount St. Helens is a national and even an international story. And first, let me start out by just introducing the author. Eric Wagner, he lives in Seattle, and he's somebody that the first time I met him, we spent about an hour talking about Emily Dickinson. And Eric's really widely read. He's just a lovely, beautiful writer. And on the other hand, he also has a PhD in biology from the UW. And it's hard for me just not to instantly hate somebody who is really good at two different things. I feel like if you're really good at writing, just leave it alone. Don't also be good at science. Or if you're really good at science, just leave it alone. Don't hog all the talents. The rest of us could use some of them. But Eric is somebody who has worked with the press before. A couple years ago, the press published a collection of photographs about the Duwamish River by Seattle Times photographer Tom Rees. And Eric wrote the text for that. And my predecessor at the press, an editor named Regan Huff, had floated to Eric the idea of writing a book about what's happened at Mount St. Helens ever since the blast occurred. Now, I would imagine most people watching this have already read Steve Olson's book, Eruption, which is the classic account of the events that led up to that day and afterwards. And that's a fantastic book. It's published by Norton. But there's a big topic that Steve touches on at the end of the book that Eric really dives into, and that's what happened afterwards. Now, right after the blast, Jerry Franklin, who was a scientist at the UW, he was one of the first scientists to show up on the scene right after, you know, acres and acres and miles were just covered with death, black ash. And Franklin climbs out of the helicopter, puts his foot down, some ash lifts up, and he looks down, he sees a little green plant, and it's fireweed. And he just thinks, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And he realized just seeing that certain ecological theories about how the earth was supposed to work were completely wrong. And so basically Mount St. Helens was one of the greatest natural experiments in history to watch how an ecological system develops. Now, if this sounds kind of wonky and nerdy and into the weeds, the book is anything but. It's really a collection of character sketches, of fantastic portraits of the scientists who do research, how they do it, how they figure out these tough scientific problems, not with calculators and not with calculus, but sitting around the campfire, kicking around ideas where they're saying, hey, wait a minute, how does a human look at the science, at how science happens? And I think that's part of what this book has an unexpected emotional power because of that.
And I'm curious, kind of behind the scenes, so you came to him with that idea?
So this is an idea that my predecessor, Regan Huff, who was an editor at the press, she hit him up with it.
Yeah.
And that's an example of editors always in the back of our mind. We're always scouting for ideas that we can match to the right author. Mm-hmm. And in this case, Eric was perfect because he was a gorgeous writer, but he also had just a great sense of he could be sophisticated about the science in a way that a lot of lay journalists couldn't.
Mm-hmm. And was it? Did the story come, did he need a couple cracks at it? I'm always curious whether, you know, learning how to tell, you know, coming into this very scientific story, it's hard to learn it can be hard to learn how to make it, or, you know, to see it as a story, or, you know, you try to approach it this way or approach it different ways. And I'm always curious how you get to the point of this finished book that is full of story and full of, you know, that works together. Dead ends or?
So Eric walked into it with a couple of really good ideas about personalities to focus on, who by using that personality to tell a story, you would, as a reader, you would have a guide through a couple of really complicated scientific topics that if you just wanted to talk about the science, it would have been a slog and nobody could get through it. But when you have these two larger than life personalities arguing with each other, it's a way as a reader, there's an emotional entry point, there's a human entry point that make these things a lot easier to read about. One thing that did happen before the book went to press is we wound up cutting a couple of chapters, and they were actually really good. And there's definitely an instance of kill your darlings. But the point was, you can't just pack everything into a book. If you want to keep a narrative really sharp and sleek and focused on the really most important issues, some things definitely got cut. And hopefully we'll see the light of day somewhere else in another form. It feels terrible to tell somebody to cut an entire chapter. I mean, it's really like telling, you know, people say, you know, when you're writing your stories, your chapters are like your children, you love all of them. Yeah. Or I once heard a songwriter in a performance who said, you know, people ask me what my favorite songs are. Songs are like your children. You love even the ugly ones. And I realized that that's how authors feel about their chapters when I ask them to cut them. They love even the ones that are the ugly ones.
To take them back behind the barn. Yeah, I've always thought that was one reason I would not be a good editor, because saying no is really hard. Even not only to projects, but within projects, you have to say no a lot. Did you have to learn how to do that as an editor, or did you have that no muscle pretty strong from day one?
That's a great question. Saying no has never gotten easier. saying no to projects, saying no to when somebody sends in a proposal and I write back a short note and say no, it feels terrible every time.
Yeah.
I think when I'm working with an editor, when I'm working with an author and asking them to cut things, I think I'm a lot more confident, definitely a lot more confident in it now, because I've seen what happens if I hold my tongue and the book gets published and it's flabby, fat,
yep.
or reviewers will pick it apart. As I remind myself that I'm doing the author a favor, and all the things that a reviewer are going to find flaws with in the published book, it's my job to preempt all those right now. And so I think knowing that and having made mistakes before where I didn't speak up, I found it a lot easier to say no.
Yeah. Hi, David.
As an author, well, I'll say this. I mean, in the opposite direction, on terms of no, as an author, you have to get used to that. Rejection is pretty standard. I mean, I have the number of article ideas I've sent out that have been rejected, book ideas that have been rejected. I mean, there's many. So you have to have that thick skin. And Andrew is also exactly right. I mean, you want someone to be able to go through with that critical eye that you don't always have as an author. I mean, a lot of times you get the classic, you get too invested in it and, oh, that's a great idea. And sometimes it's nice really just to have someone say it, and it's easier in some sense to have someone go, we could probably cut that and that and that and that. And it does help. I mean, and obviously you learn who knows what they're doing and who doesn't know what they're doing. So
yeah. And right, as an author, when you think, oh, I spent 2 months on that and I, all the work, the reader doesn't need to know, or it doesn't help the reader know all the work you put into something, even if it was a dead end or a,
right.
Yeah. But it's hard to let that go as an author.
Yeah.
I'd like to add to that. I think as an editor, what I think of when I give author feedback is my job first and foremost is identifying problems. I can offer a solution if it helps the author, but oftentimes when I point out a problem with the manuscript, the author will come back with a solution that's far more ingenious than what I would have come up with.
Right.
And far more true to the manuscript than what I would have come up with. So I think about it less as imposing my vision, as more about me troubleshooting and leaving it in the author's court about the best way to address that.
Uh-huh.
Though God knows I have opinions if they do one thing.
Do you want to talk about The River That Made Seattle?
This is a book that...
I wish I had one. I feel left out. Mine hasn't arrived yet. I'll get it.
So this is a book that's coming out, I believe, in July.
Officially.
Officially. BJ Cummings is a name. She lives in Seattle, and she's somebody that if you're at all involved in environmental movements or environmental activism in Seattle, she's a name that you might recognize. BJ is somebody who has been highly involved in the cleanup of the Duwamish River. And I think that for most people, when they think about the Duwamish River, what they think of is pollution. They think of an industrial wasteland. They think of a mess. They think of the fact that it's a Superfund site, it's been complicated. They see pipes, mysterious chemicals dripping out of them. And BJ is somebody who played a key role in helping clean up the river over the past few decades. She's somebody who played an active role in lobbying for the recognition as a Superfund site, played a role in helping to coordinate the really difficult conversations among different players to get it cleaned up. But something that, and the book certainly talks about that, which is important. But what she really wants people to think about the fact is that if you can't know Seattle history without knowing the history of the Duwamish River, and without knowing that it is something far richer and more special and more ecologically interesting over the past hundreds of years, over the past millennia, than you would get if you just stopped at the word Superfund right now. And so for this book, she did a lot of original archival research. She worked closely with the Duwamish tribe to tell stories of their family members going back generations. And so basically, anyone who wants to know about Seattle history, these are parts of Seattle history that have never been told before. Mm-hmm. And this is an authoritative work. I mean, it's certainly a definitive work, but this is definitely a book for general readers who want to know more about where they live and why it looks like why it does.
Is this her first book?
I believe she published another book maybe 30 years ago.
Oh, okay. But she mainly, I mean, her career is more as an activist
Absolutely.
than a writer.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's a beautifully written book.
Yeah, yeah. And to keep with the theme, did you come to her? Did she come to you?
This is a case where she came to us. And one reason is that presses try to consciously build really distinctive identities and really distinctive subject areas that we publish in. So over time, people do come to us. Like
yeah,
the example,
if I didn't need to see you the colophon on the spine. If I just seen this, I would have guessed UW Press.
Yep.
And so she came to you with this history and wanting to do it as a history, not just a focus on the activism side, that she really wanted to dig
right.
deeper. Yeah.
Right.
David, and Too High and Too Steep, you talk, I'm trying to remember from reading it, you talk a little bit about the history of the built Seattle. I forget if the Duwamish came into that.
I don't. I purposely chose not to, because it was just a whole nother level of detail that I didn't feel as qualified to write. So I'm going to close this window.
Okay.
If you can hear that music in the background, my neighbor just showed up, so it'll quiet down in a second. But no, I decided, I mean, I knew that it was a rich history, but certainly didn't know how rich it was.
Yeah. And so this, and so what she has found is it hasn't really been published in any way before.
Correct. A lot of it's new archives, a lot of it's new material from oral histories, and of course, bringing it together in one single narrative. Like it's really just a great piece of storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Is it chronological?
Oh, absolutely. It starts out with creation stories. I mean, both in terms of Western science, but also in terms of like how tribal nations in the region, how they came to people Puget Sound and to people the area around it. So, and she places those stories side by side.
And was it, I mean, yeah, what was the Duwamish like 200 years ago, physically, I guess, for us to imagine before?
So physically very different. Right now, what you see when you look at the Duwamish River, and actually David probably knows a lot more about this than me, is a waterway that has been shaped by humans in a really manhandled, right, exactly. Like if you look at a map of where the waterway was 100 years ago or 150 years ago versus now it's very unnatural. It's a lot of straight lines. And it used to be a really natural, lovely, curving river that was rich for agriculture. There were communities who were active fishers and lived on the water. It was a sense of community. It was bucolic and every lovely thing you could imagine before people were able to start cashing in on it and polluting the waters.
Yeah, like that word wetlands that has been, as we've come to learn, what a rich, instead of being swampland, like where you just bury mobsters, it's
right.
Rich both for people and nature when left alone.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do we want to talk about David now?
We
Shall
do.
we talk more about water? So what's, I don't have anything to hold up. I know, Dave, you don't have the manuscript there to...
Oh, God. Somewhere there are many copies of it printed out. It's scary how many times I've printed it out.
Right.
I'm one of the people who needs both. I do work on the screen, but when I do my final edit, it's always in a hard copy. I have to have hard copy.
Yeah.
I can introduce David briefly.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I know you ran through the official credentials earlier, but one thing to know about David is that he's a former national park ranger and was a national park ranger at Arches National Park. And once I realized that, I felt like so much about David was explained. The way that he had this command of natural history, but he had this great command of humans, and that he could walk and just explain it all to you in like the absolute best storytelling style you can imagine. I think I also like David because anyone who's ever been to one of his presentations knows that he's really funny. And I think for most of us, if we ever see a stand-up comic, we leave feeling about, 10 IQ points dumber. I think the great thing about going to one of David's presentations is he's so funny, and you walk away feeling 10 IQ points smarter. You just know so many things that you never knew before. And an interesting about David is that while he does write popular histories that are very much geared at the lay reader, he does so much archival research of his own that's original. He's somebody who also informs, the more wonky or scholarly side we do, even though in his books that comes across in the most amusing, entertaining, great storytelling kind of way.
Thank you.
So how did this start? So the title is Homewaters. What's the subtitle again? It's
A Human and Natural History of Puget Sound.
And where did this germ start growing in your head?
About 4 years ago, maybe even a little bit longer. It just popped into my head. Oh, it'd be interesting to do a book about human and natural history of Puget Sound. And part of it was thinking about how do I expand the geography that I've been writing about. My earlier books, mostly, except for Karen's, but I mean the sort of major books I've been working on have been focused on Seattle. And I love this area. And I wanted to see, okay, what's the next logical bigger? And Puget Sound was it. And realized that there really wasn't anything about that wove together both of those. Plus, most of the human histories that had been written, so many of them were early histories, very interesting ones, but often written from the, to put it simply, white man point of view. And Puget Sound was discovered in 1792 by George Vancouver. And I'm like, well, I think there were some people here for since time immemorial. So I wanted to tell a book that took into a much broader perspective on it. So once I sort of had started talking to the press about it, I had sort of gave them this kernel of an idea with really not much more of an idea. And I think that's one of the things where I benefit from is working with the same press multiple times. So they knew that, okay, he has an idea, he can probably, there's a good chance he can find the stories that fit, but let's give him an opportunity. Let's listen to him without knowing as much detail. So I spent 6 months interviewing people, scientists, historians, tribal people, really just trying to get when I tell you this idea, what are the stories that come together? And so that really is where the origin of it, the book was, and then went to the UW Press, hammered out a proposal, and then moved forward. And started writing.
And do you research, and what's your back and forth between research and writing? Or do you just dig, and then sit down to write, or are you writing a chapter?
It's interesting. So I went to school. My college degree is at a place called Colorado College. So you take one class at a time for 3.5 weeks, and then you take another class at a time for 3.5 weeks. And I still operate that way. Like if I get a plate of food, I eat all the peas, and then I eat all this, and then I don't mix. It's just gross. So I basically once I figured out the chapters, I basically write a chapter and then do everything for it, research, write, and then move on to the next one. And for better or worse, for me, since my books don't really have a chronological, he died, she died, blah, blah, blah. The chapters, even though I think they work better together, can be read certainly separately. So then they can also be written separately. And then themes emerge throughout, things obviously get woven back and forth, but they're more or less standalone chapters.
And you would send a chapter into the editor?
No, they didn't see anything until the end. It's part because I think we've had a relationship, and there was a trust there with what I was doing. That being said, one of the things that's very different about an academic press versus working for Mountaineers and other trade publishers I've worked for is that academic presses require peer review. So when a manuscript gets turned in, it can still be, it needs to go out. Presses send it out to 2 anonymous peer reviewers. So I had worked on this book for a couple of years. I sent it in to the press, and the 2 reviewers came back, had some issues with the book. which then forced me to make some big editorial changes in it and think of it, take some new ways to think about the chapter, or the chapter is the beginning, and so that's very different. And in some sense, it can happen in the editorial process of a non-academic press, but an academic press is very specific, because if it doesn't make it past peer review, the book, it can die.
And the peer review is focused on, it's less from a trade reader, it's more on the scholarly, so that their objections would be more on scholarly issues rather than, oh, this story kind of falls apart. It's much more on scholarly than on style issues, I guess. Is that true?
I can answer that. So for this book, which is a popular science book about a lot of science, for peer review, we sent it out to one popular science writer who had written lots of book narratives and could talk a lot about what makes a narrative good or not. We also sent it out to a very senior scientist who returned to us basically a list of page by page, here are mistakes. Here's a place where you have the wrong genus and species, or, this theory is a little more complex than you say so. And this is really important to the press, because as a university press, everything we publish, we want it to be authoritative and definitive. And if it can be picked apart, we want to pick it apart before we publish it. Break it till it works. And so that's the purpose of us doing this kind of peer review for our regional trade books. Like with David's book, is anywhere that we can poke it or anywhere there's a weak spot, we want to address that now. So when the book comes out, it's going to be an enduring work for many, many years to come, because the scholarship and the research is so authoritative. Yeah,
but it could be. I mean, that the other reviewer though was also looking at it with a storyteller's eye.
Absolutely.
But that's interesting, because I think I thought of peer review as being strictly nitpicking the facts, but it also can be.
You are right, actually. We do peer review for general interest books because we do peer review for academic books, and academic books are all about picking apart, and they're not about storytelling.
Right.
We do do it differently for a popular book, like what David does.
Yeah, interesting.
Because we want it to be both fun but also reliable.
Okay.
And I think the peer review on all my books, has been generally from, oddly enough, less from a pick it apart fact and getting it right. It's been more from a stylistic point of view. Did you cover the subject right? Are you missing things? And I think in part I benefit somewhat by writing books like Too High and Too Steep, where there really was there's really very few people who could, in some sense, comment on it from an expert level, because again, like BJ does, digging into the archives, trying to find things that other people hadn't. Certainly there's some big picture ideas. And on this one, particularly the new book, which I spend a lot more time writing about the Coast Salish, the indigenous people of this area, which I had not written about before. And so that was something where even before I submitted it to the press, I submitted the 4 or 5 chapters that deal most strongly with issues, indigenous people, to people who I thought would be wiser, more aware of issues than I was. And that was a big concern for me, was to try and get that part of the story right, get it respectful of the stories that I'd heard from interviewing people, and again, doing research.
This is the biggest subject you've tackled. Would you say that?
Yeah, I think so. As I think about it, yeah. I think it goes into some areas that I hadn't thought of before. Again, as I said, Native people, but it's a broader geographic, and it also, Puget Sound, and this is a central theme of the book, is Puget Sound to me is at this really critical phase in its history. It's arguably really in better shape than it's been in many decades, in the sense that we've cleaned up a lot of the pollution. And from that point of view, it's better. We have a much different focus on it. We don't view it so much as a resource to exploit, as was certainly during the early history of Puget Sound after settlement. And so I think that's changed, but we also know that there are many problems, Tlaaqua being sort of the exemplar of that story. But we are at that point, are we going to make that change? and are we going to continue to improve it? And that really became a driving sort of part of the story for me. And so in that sense, it's bigger than other books I've done where it was actually more, I wouldn't say an activist point of view, but more of a strong viewpoint. Would you agree, Andrew?
Yeah, and that's actually part of where the title comes from, Homewaters, because it's not like this is a book about the story of David Williams' thought and memoir, but it's a story about the connection to the land and the waters.
And kind of forward thinking, maybe in a way that other books haven't been.
Yeah, I mean, it's really trying to think about, I mean, I make the point that, not that it's an obvious, is that, it's really up to all of us. And we are at this point where we need to think about our connections to this place. And as we develop those and strengthen that relationship, I mean, the final line is, I think, something to the fact that, if we don't, if we really believe in this place, then we have no choice but to work towards making it a better place, better stewardship, more sustainable, more respectful of all the species that are here and all the people that are here.
Was it structurally, were there challenges in kind of roping together this big subject, or did you have a kind of through line that you could see from the beginning?
It was a challenge, in part because I think in previous books where I've sort of woven together human and natural history, they have been a little bit more, each chapter has both subjects in it. Right. And this book is more broken into more of a human, I would say more of a human history section, and the natural history section, which obviously has lots of human history, is a little bit separate. But to me, the reason to do that was to really provide this bigger picture that I don't think we can understand the sound without understanding some of these deeper stories. How did people move into this landscape? How do we view the sound as a maritime highway? What's the history of warfare in Puget Sound? So it's been it sort of came together through a variety of different ideas, but it was a conscious decision to weave them sort of these two parts and then allow them to flow together.
Did Andrew kill any chapters that you liked?
Actually, after it had been accepted, I had a task to cut about 12%, 10 or 12% of the book. So I ended up cutting out 15,000 words after the manuscript had been accepted. And again, that really exemplifies, sort of what Andrew said earlier, is that he asked me to do it. I said, do you have any suggestions? He said, no, I'd rather you do it. And so I went through and pulled out things and edited and tightened. And editing is a lot easier, and cutting is a lot easier to happen weeks or months after you have turned in something and you're not as sort of in love with what you had. And it's a challenge because you do all this research, like, oh, here's a really neat fact. And like, okay, it's not that interesting. Mm-hmm. So even though the discussions about gooey duck sex and oyster sex and rockfish sex, they're still in there. I just want to clarify, I didn't cut out anything to do with sex.
That was not on the table.
No. I said that to Andrew immediately, and he was a little nervous, but he went for it eventually.
Could you, I don't think people probably can see the detail of your vest. Could you explain?
This is a map of Seattle. I'm going to turn my back to you all. You can see it very clearly. So when Too High and Too Steep came out, my wife made this vest for me because I love maps, and I'm trying to still figure out a Puget Sound map for a vest. If anyone has the material and wants it sent
for you to wear to your events in the spring.
Yeah, it's my event one, and It's funny because I've periodically been at events and I feel like someone tapping on my back is like, oh, I live right here.
Yeah. And so there's not a cover yet, and there's not a strict pub date yet. We're thinking spring 2021 for Homewaters.
Yeah, it's going to copy editing. I think it was sent out on Friday to copy editor, so that's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really good timing. I had a paragraph I wanted to add back that I had edited out, and I got it in, just snuck it in just in time. So
Are you a writer who would edit up until the very last minute you're allowed to, or can you kind of let things go?
yeah, editing you can do all the time. You know, every time I reread something, I'm like, oh, I could tweak that and tweak that, and I mean that's that's the beauty of deadlines.
Yeah. And I guess as many writers say that the time that you see the most, and editors probably too, this time that you see all the things you want to change is when the published copy arrives. And then you're like, oh, right, that sentence. Yeah. I'm sure it's always the case.
There's a reason I don't read my books when after they're out.
So let's see.
There's a question on.
Yeah, you guys can see the questions too?
Yeah, when
Okay.
remaindering happens to good books, what happened? Are there patterns for what goes wrong, for example?
Good question. As someone who has written one book that was remaindered fairly quickly and is now available at Phinney Books, not to plug myself, but for $4.98. I have all the copies of my book that anyone would ever want. I've come to embrace the remaindering process. But I would love to hear both of you guys talk about that.
It seems there's two things. I mean, there's one, sometimes get remaindered because of a sort of a subsequent edition of it. You know, the book comes out it's out in hardback initially, then they put it out in paperback, or they do paperback and they print, it's the 17th printing and then it dies. I mean, that's a little bit unusual, but you certainly see some of it. It's a hard field. As Andrew said at the very beginning, being a publicist, how do you get the word out on stuff? I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's some absurd number of books are published in this modern world. So,
yeah. To explain to people outside the business, remainders are often, if you go into a bookstore like ours, I can actually, this is our sale table. So they're books that the publisher, it's kind of publishers overstock that they will send to a dealer, and this whole netherworld of dealers who will buy really for pennies on the dollar and then sell them to bookstores to sell on their sale tables. And it's often books that, not necessarily that failed, but that there was just a gap between the amount published. And so it could have been a book that was a bestseller, but they were just more published than they looked like they would need. And some books get remaindered even while they're being published. Some of that I don't understand. Does UW Press do a lot of remaindering?
No, the issue is not that a book fails. The issue is that the publisher published more copies than they were able to sell. Right. And once you actually have those copies, if they're not actively moving, you still have to pay a warehouse to store them. So they actually cost the publisher money if they can't offload them on somebody. First of all, I'd say if you're an author, there is absolutely no shame in being remaindered.
To the best of us.
Happens to Stephen King. I mean, it happens to everybody. There are different ways that publishers unload their stocks, and they'll sell to a variety of vendors for cheaper rates to do that. So in terms of patterns, I think that the remainders happen most likely to really big books that the publishers thought would be bigger than they were. Remainders don't happen to smaller books or smaller print runs. I'd say right now, the way the publishers think about it is that, in the olden days, your first print run, you were printing for 2 years. Like you would calculate what would be my first 2 year sales, let's print them all right now. It's a lot easier and a lot faster to print books than it used to be. And so for most presses, when they do initial print runs, they're thinking more like the first 3 months or first year, much smaller increments. And that's great because that helps to prevent this problem.
So are there fewer remainders out there because it's more efficient?
I'd actually you'd be a better judge of that, Tom, than me as to what comes your way.
I haven't been doing this long enough to know, but it seems like there would be almost naturally.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And you'd think there would be fewer now. But the market is just so persnickety, as you well know. And I mean, I was talking to Ivan Doig many years ago, and he said that his publisher said to them, there are 3 things that make a bestseller. The problem is no one knows what they are.
Right.
So
Well, it used to be golf and dogs and some other thing. Like if you could write a book about golf. Now I feel like it's solitude and walking and quiet.
right.
If I have books with one of those three things in the title, so nobody wants to play golf. Well, golf was walking and solitude also, but
Good walk spoiled.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's that is the beauty of the business that we're in, is that, I mean, can be very frustrating for writers and authors and booksellers, but if we knew what was going to sell, it wouldn't be as interesting as it is. That's the nice way of looking at it.
And it's and particularly in this world right now, I mean, it's that opportunity to travel, the classic line, you don't travel without ever having to leave home. And I mean, that's a beautiful thing. And I think what's great that the UW Press is doing, and they're not alone, is that we're finally starting to see the stories come out about Seattle and Washington State history that are much greater diversity than we've seen in the past. And I think that's a big positive change, that stories are being shared and told and reaching the world that had not ever been. I mean, again, as I said, it used to just be old white guys wrote books, and so it's nice that there's a diversity.
No, I feel like I mean the regional history section of our store is always one of my favorite sections, and I feel like it's one of the most dynamic sections these days. That it's not settled history. I mean, we have some of the old stuff here, but I feel like even that stuff and I think you guys have reprinted a lot of it, but now it's read in context, which doesn't make it any less interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But we're retelling a lot of those stories while keeping the old stories alive and in print.
Yeah.
I guess my last question is, what's it like for university presses these days? It's never easy, but I know that some of that some presses across the country have been closing down or have had dramas with their overseers. But it's all, you guys are always on the edge. It seems from the outside like UW is really vibrant and healthy. Where do you see university presses in this current context?
Let me answer this way. I'm thinking back to like March or April when, we'd first gone into shelter at home and quarantine, and, there are Americans dying outside. And, I was thinking about, the books that I had signed 2 years ago that were coming out this summer, and thinking, in context of this public health crisis, what does my enthusiasm from 2 years matter to, how do the books map on neatly to what we're concerned about right now? And I realized that going back to the book I mentioned earlier about the Great Earthquake, the Great Quake debate, 100 years ago, Southern California, that's a book about how scientists communicate risk to the general public. And that is something that is incredibly timely right now. That book wasn't designed to be timely. But university presses publish books on enduring topics with enduring insights and enduring relevance. And the idea is that we do books that are important all the time. They may not be, match the headlines exactly, but they're things that are always important in our society. And so I think that going back to, say, March and April, there's a lot of alarm, like, are we safe? Are our employees safe? And I think we've gotten past that to the point where we are being more proactive about thinking about where the press is going to be in a couple of years, rather than just reacting to the current circumstances. So I would say, if anything, the mood in university press publishing right now is defiantly optimistic. There's a reason we do these books. There's a larger mission, and that mission remains. It's as important as ever. Every time I see another journalist getting laid off, I'm like, it's so important that we get another thoroughly well-sourced book out there.
Yeah, defiantly optimistic. I mean, that describes book selling as well.
Yes, absolutely.
All the things we do in this business. Well, thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Fun. We're glad to have the first two books you talked about in the store already, and we're going to start looking. That's like the first 2021 book that I've really gotten to talk about, and that's one of the fun things about our business also, is we're always looking ahead. So I can guarantee that Homewaters will be stacked high at Phinney Books in in spring of 2021.
Yay.
Good to see you guys. Thanks everybody for signing on. We'll have this up on our YouTube channel as soon as Haley and I can get it there. And the books that Andrew talked about will feature in our next newsletter and on our website. And look forward to getting them into your hands. Thanks for joining us, everybody.